What would shows be like if there were no pilot episodes? Game of Thrones without Emilia Clarke, The Big Bang Theory without Howard and Raj, and Sherlock short and boring. This is a little longer and my name is Max. Today I'll tell you what a pilot episode is, why it's so important for a TV show, and what the pilots of famous series look like. Most shows start with a pilot episode. You've probably heard people say the pilot of this or that show just came out. But it's not just a fancy name for the first episode, it actually has a very clear purpose. Once a script is written and the decision is made to film it, there are two options: start shooting the first episode, then the second, and so on. Second way, shoot just the pilot. A pilot is basically a test episode, a kind of trial run. In short, it's made to be shown to someone, whether it's a focus group producers or network executives. Their feedback helps decide what needs to change in the show, or whether it should move forward at all. Or maybe it's time to switch careers. Just kidding. Now imagine you're a showrunner holding a script for a TV show you want to make. You've even raised some money, assembled a team, found locations, you're ready to start filming, but maybe your budget isn't huge, or no network or streaming service has picked up your show yet. Maybe you're unsure if your comedy is actually funny to an audience, not just to you. There are a lot of unknowns. So before committing, you need to see if everything in your show works. Maybe a storyline is unnecessary, an actor doesn't quite fit, or you're still not sure who your audience is. That's why you make a pilot, show it to a focus group and get a verdict. What's wrong with your show? Let's jump straight into an example of how a pilot episode can turn a show into a hit. Because after the pilot, this show was almost cancelled. Game of Thrones had a pilot episode, and it had a huge impact on the show we eventually saw. This test episode was filmed as a demonstration for HBO. It was never aired on television, never included in Blu-ray releases, and it's unclear if audiences will ever get to see the full version of that pilot. The episode wasn't terrible, but many details were changed. At the same time, some scenes from that pilot made it into the final cut of the very first episode we all watched. Winter is Coming. The pilot was directed by Tom McCarthy, who at the time had very little directing experience, just 2 films to his name, The Visitor and The Station Agent. He was replaced by Timothy Van Patten, a far more experienced director, especially in television. If you name 5 big TV shows, chances are he worked on at least 2 of them. His awesome includes The Sopranos, Sex and the City, The Wire, Boardwalk Empire, and many others. Van Patten is one of the most prolific TV directors out there. Since McCarthy was involved in casting, and some of his scenes remained in the final version, his name stayed in the credits, not as a director, but as a consulting producer. And speaking of casting, if the original pilot had been approved without any changes, we never would have seen Emilia Clarke in this show. Because in that first version, the Mother of Dragons was played by Tamzin Merchant. Do you know who Tamzin Merchant is? Me not. Okay, that's not entirely fair. She's an established actress known for The Tudors, Salem, and Carnival Row, but she never reached the same level of fame as Emilia Clarke. That said, Merchant wasn't exactly a victim of the pilot. She wasn't fired in disgrace. Later she admitted that she simply wasn't interested in the role or the story of Game of Thrones in general. She just didn't connect with it. Maybe she was just saving face, but let's take her at her word. Another major casting change after the pilot was the role of Catelyn Stark. Initially, she was played by Jennifer Ahle, not Machel Fairley, and after the reshoots were announced, Ahle herself decided to step away. She didn't want to relocate to Northern Ireland for filming. And speaking of locations, that was another major change. The original pilot was shot in Scotland and Morocco, but the full series was filmed primarily in Northern Ireland, Croatia, and Malta. Morocco wasn't completely abandoned, though it was used again in season 3. Even the author of A Song of Ice and Fire, George Martin, made a cameo in the pilot. He played one of the aristocratic guests at the wedding. It got cut. There were plenty of other changes, some cosmetic, like different hairstyles and costumes and some narrative. For example, the original pilot didn't make it clear that Jaime and Cersei were siblings, which messed with the logic of why Jaime pushed Bran out of the window. Once the pilot was finished, Benioff and Weiss, those guys, the ones everyone blames for the finale. showed it to their friends and family. The reactions were not great. Just like HBO's reaction, they had spent $10 million on an episode that looked like it was shot in someone's backyard. But the creators acknowledged their mistakes, promised to fix everything, and reshot the first episode. And now, knowing how the show turned out, we can only be grateful they didn't give up on Game of Thrones. Usually a pilot episode serves as the first episode of a show. It sets up the story and introduces the main characters. But sometimes, even if a pilot gets the green light, the network decides it doesn't quite work as the first episode. In that case, it might still air later in the season. That's exactly what happened with the cult series Firefly. The original pilot Serenity didn't sit well with the execs at Fox, so they decided to rewrite the script for the second episode and use that as the premiere instead. Serenity was pushed to the end of the season, which, as we now know, became the end of the entire series. That's how Firefly originally aired on television, with Serenity as the final episode. Today, however, the show is streamed in its intended order. Still, we never got a continuation. When a pilot doesn't work as the first episode but isn't bad enough to scrap entirely, it often gets repurposed as a flashback episode. If the plot involves a look into the past scenes from the pilot, can be used for that. A classic example is the original Star Trek series. NBC rejected the initial pilot, The Cage, but when the show was picked up, they took footage from that unused episode and incorporated it into another episode as flashbacks. Star Trek ended up having more than one pilot. Since The Cage didn't land well with the network, they agreed to let the creators try again. The second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, fared much better. It was included in the series, but as the third episode, not the first. The ways of Star Trek are truly mysterious. Pilots can be rejected, approved, or even get the green light only to be completely reshot, just like what happened with Game of Thrones. The same fate befell Sherlock, which was originally conceived as a series with 1-hour episodes, but ended up with feature-length episodes instead. The original Sherlock pilot was called a disaster in the press. It had poor pacing, an underwhelming story, and some scenes that looked downright cheap. And yet, it cost £800,000 to make. BBC increased the budget and allowed more time for filming, and we all know how that turned out. There are plenty of differences between the pilot and A Study in Pink, the episode that ultimately aired. The visual style, the plot, and even small details changed, like Watson's phone, which was originally an iPhone. More significantly, Mycroft Holmes didn't appear in the pilot at all, and Moriarty had no connection to the case Holmes and Watson were investigating. These changes might seem minor, but they make a real impact. And unlike the unaired Game of Thrones, pilot this one is actually available. You can easily find it online. If you watch it, or already have, let me know what you think in the comments. And of course, if you enjoy this video, hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps us out. Otherwise, we might have to scrap this pilot episode and reshoot the whole thing. Remember Katie from The Big Bang Theory? She was Sheldon and Leonard's neighbor, and Leonard even had a crush on her. Probably not because she only appeared in the unaired pilot before the show was completely reworked. Instead of Katie, we got the Penny we all know and love. CBS strongly disliked the original Big Bang Theory pilot, but they saw potential in the format. They kept Sheldon and Leonard, but replaced Katie, played by Amanda Walsh, with Penny, who was much more likable. Test audiences found Katie too aggressive and mean-spirited. The pilot also lacked Howard and Rajesh. Instead, there was a character named Gilda, a close friend and colleague of Sheldon and Leonard. And based on a few hints, she may have even had a past romantic relationship with Sheldon. Which means Sheldon himself was different. He was played by the same actor Jim Parsons, but his personality was noticeably altered. He was less socially awkward and, judging by his interactions with Gilda, showed more interest in romantic relationships. Out of all the characters who made it into the final series, only 3 were in the original pilot: Sheldon, Leonard, and Althea, the nurse who later appeared in a few medically themed episodes. And perhaps the biggest shocker? In the pilot, the elevator in their apartment building actually worked. Now that's science fiction. Some shows, like the ones I mentioned earlier, were very close to having their pilot episode be their only episode. Other pilots also received mixed reactions, but instead of reshooting or scrapping them, the network simply adjusted the shows over time based on audience feedback. That's exactly what happened with the American version of The Office. Its pilot didn't impress many viewers, and the entire first season feels quite different from the rest of the show. The pilot was nearly a shot-for-shot remake of the British version's first episode, but after lukewarm reception, the creators started adapting it for an American audience, toning down the harsher humour. By the way, we have a video called What is Mockumentary, where we discuss The Office in detail. Check it out if you're interested. A more recent example of a show evolving after its pilot is High Potential, a remake of a French series. The story follows Morgan Guillory, a cleaning woman with a genius-level IQ of 160. By the end of the pilot, she's already working as a consultant for the police, solving crimes. After the pilot aired, High Potential underwent a few subtle changes. The number of quirky montage sequences was significantly reduced, and the show's tone shifted from pure comedy to a more balanced dramedy. The disappearance of Morgan's neighbor, a florist who watched her kids in the pilot. Most likely, the writer saw his character as unnecessary, so his role was redistributed. Morgan's ex-husband, for instance, took on more responsibility for their children. The show has received solid ratings and is likely to be renewed for a second season, or, depending on when you're watching this, it might already have been. Small tweaks like these can not only improve a show but also expand its audience. Even if a change causes someone like me to lose interest, say, if I stopped watching because there were fewer jokes, it might attract 3 new viewers in return. By becoming more universal, the show ultimately gains a broader, more diverse audience. Some pilots are so bad that networks decide not to move forward with them at all.
I could eat a whole bottle too.
Of course, a bad pilot isn't the only reason a show might never get made. It could be too expensive, creative differences might arise between the writers and producers, the network's strategy might change, or the timing could simply be wrong, like with Aquaman. You've probably never heard of it because it never aired, even though a pilot was filmed and it wasn't all that bad, at least by 2006 standards. The idea came from the creators of Smallville, who introduced Arthur Curry aka Aquaman in the show's 5th season. That episode, where he arrives to stop the development of an underwater weapon, became the highest rated of the season. In Smallville, he was played by Alan Ritchson. If you've watched Reacher, you know him well. The success led to talks of a separate Aquaman series, not a spin-off but an independent show. For the lead role, they cast Justin Hartley, who's now well known for This Is Us. Interestingly, Hartley later joined Smallville, but as a completely different DC character, Oliver Queen, aka Green Arrow. The Aquaman pilot was ultimately a victim of bad timing. Just as it was completed, 2 networks merged and the show was deemed too expensive for the new lineup. The pilot was shelved well, actually. It ended up on iTunes, where it became the most downloaded TV episode. And just like that, a potential hit never saw the light of day. A similar fate befell Beverly Hills Cop. In 2013, a TV series based on the classic 80s films almost happened, and Eddie Murphy was even involved, though not as the lead. The show was meant to follow Axel Foley's son, Aaron, played by Brandon Jackson, but CBS wasn't impressed with the pilot and decided not to move forward. According to rumors and Murphy himself, the network wanted him to appear in every episode. He, however, wasn't interested, so the project fell apart. Fun fact, the pilot was directed by Barry Sonnenfeld, the filmmaker behind Men in Black and The Addams Family. Then there's a special kind of pilot called a backdoor pilot. These are episodes within an existing series that serve as a test run for a potential spin-off. Sounds complicated? Let's break it down with an example. And it's a show you might have heard about just a few minutes ago. This is The Office. Episode 17 of Season 9 was a backdoor pilot for a spin-off called The Farm, centered around Dwight Schrute's life on his family's beet farm. But NBC wasn't very interested in the show, so the episode was slightly reshot, the editing was adjusted, and it simply became part of the 9th season of The Office. The episode even featured several guest stars who were supposed to be series regulars in The Farm, including Thomas Middleditch, who, just a year later, became the star of Silicon Valley. The list of pilots that never became shows is long. Amazon's The Dark Tower, the sitcom Super Clyde starring Rupert Grint and Stephen Fry, a Zombieland series based on the movie, and many more. The big question is, could any of these have been hits if they had made it to air? And here we are at the most crucial moment, acknowledging that a pilot episode is a key element in creating a great show. In recent years, with the rise of streaming platforms and their own development strategies, pilot episodes have become less common. Maybe that's why we're seeing more and more mediocre shows? A pilot can make a show better, or it can be the reason a series never gets made at all. But even in that case, it shouldn't be seen as a failure. After all, it's better to waste time and money on filming a single unsuccessful episode than to produce an entire bad season and lose both on a much larger scale. Goodbye, everyone.